Welcome to the Low Carb MD podcast. No one is beyond help. No one is beyond hope.
As we have always said, we are bringing you medical information and cutting-edge science, but none of this is medical advice. Please seek out input from your own doctor.
It's that prostate.
Hello and welcome back to the Low Carb MD podcast. Tro, we did it again. We got Dr. Ben Bikman. He told us not to call him doctor, but I couldn't help it just this one time. But we have Ben Bikman. He's one of our big, he's taught us a lot, Tro. I mean, when we went back to our overview, a lot of his message and what he's doing has impacted us. And so it's such an honor to have you back, Ben. Tro, what do you have to say, man?
No, all I have to say is this, he is light years ahead of most of us doctors. He's thinking about ways he can nourish the people around him. He's thinking about ways to support them intellectually by being an author, esteemed author, as well as an esteemed scientist, published work. But not only that, he's so damn clinical, man. I'm thinking about how do I get my community and invigorated about exercise. This guy's already done an exercise program with his community, with a nutrition program, and he's measured the outcomes, and he published a report. And here I am thinking, I'm asked right before we got on the show, I'm asking Ben, how do I teach me? I'm literally like begging, I'm like, Ben, please help me. You know, I have Thomas Clifford and me, we're trying to get this like local program up, and we need the help and we need the smarts of people like him and the passion of people like him. So I'm really happy.
And we dragged him in to talk about his book, Why We Get Sick. And man, as soon as I heard it was coming out, I ordered it right away at Amazon. I'm on the pre-order. I better get it the first before everyone else, and I'll be smart for a couple of days before everyone else gets it. But Ben, tell us about the book and what you're doing. And man, you're just doing so many great things, and we're stoked to have you on.
Oh, guys, thanks for that introduction. I really am delighted to be back with you guys. It's always a great, fun, stimulating and friendly conversation. So yeah, Tro, I liked what you said though with regards to what I do. As you guys know, there is something unique about being in academia, good and bad. I get paid to be curious. That really is the job as a scientist, and it's not lucrative, but it is rewarding in that I can ask myself a question on a morning, and depending on what my schedule is like, I can just find answers to that question. And if I don't find an answer to the question from the published literature, then I can say, well, is this a question that I can answer in my own lab with the means that I have at my disposal? So there is something really rewarding about that. But the frustrating part about it is if you think you are finding answers as a scientist, there's nothing you can do about it. I mean, at the best outcome is you can publish a paper that no one will read, except another handful of scientists. And so the idea that there are physicians and healthcare practitioners like you guys, that you guys are where the rubber meets the road. And so my biggest hope is that if I find an answer to a question, can I somehow convey that to someone who can do something with it? And that's essentially my whole involvement in social media. In any talks I give or podcasts, it is this hope that, and not even smug, I hope, a genuine, humble hope. Is there knowledge I have that can benefit someone? Well, then how can I get it to them? Because academia has just so many barriers. Tro, you'd mentioned in our first talk that it really is this ivory tower, and we're looking at the world and as sort of philosophers and wondering how it works. So I'm thrilled to be able to interact with clinicians. It really is a rewarding part of the job that frustrated me for too long. And then, Brian, thanks for mentioning the book. Why We Get Sick was written really in an effort to continue to bridge that gap that I have a certain perspective on chronic disease, which is the relevance of insulin resistance, that this disorder, insulin resistance, is too often undiagnosed and misdiagnosed, where someone's coming in with fertility problems like PCOS and hypertension or fatty liver disease, and rather than look at those as three distinct problems, acknowledge that there's an enormous body of evidence that suggests that each of those disorders and many more are all branches coming off the same tree. So quit trying to hack away at the branches and go right to the trunk and address the problem. So Why We Get Sick basically tells that story. What is insulin resistance? Why does it matter? What are the diseases? Well, how do you get it? What are the diseases connected to it? And then it ends with a happy ending, which is here are some of the solutions, because it is very solvable. And that covers a spectrum of things, but at the heart of it all is you got to change your diet. So that's my long response to your intro.
I think that's so key, and I wanna ask you about this because I don't think people appreciate the fact that metabolic syndrome, obesity, diabetes, potentially PCOS, potentially inflammatory conditions, potentially autoimmune conditions, allergies, that mental health issues, that all of these may share a common root or at least share exacerbating factors.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, well
so at
said.
the least, they're sharing exacerbating factors. They may not be a unifying cause to all of them, but ask any doctor, okay? You get stressed out, what happens? Migraines come back, sleeplessness happens, right? You binge eat, you binge drink alcohol, right? There's a common factor. It's not that stress led to all this, but stress seems to exacerbate all these other things. So how much of insulin resistance do you think is a cause of disease, and how much of it is an exacerbating factor?
Yeah.
Is that a tough question? I know it's like,
well, no. It's a great question. It's a great question. It's a big answer, and it really depends on the disorder. But you expressed it perfectly. If we look across the gamut of non-infectious chronic diseases, we can create a bit of a division between them, where there are some where insulin resistance is causal, like essential hypertension. That is very often going to be connected to insulin resistance. And then if you look at something like breast cancer, no, insulin resistance isn't causing it, but the evidence suggests it's definitely making it worse or exacerbating it, as you said perfectly. And we see that in breast tumors, where they have 7 times more insulin receptors than normal breast tissue. That means that tumor is 7 times more responsive to insulin's growth or anabolic signal. It's stimulating the growth of that breast tumor. So yeah, the disorders are going to fall in two categories, where the insulin resistance is directly causing it, or it's simply making it worse. It's amplifying it. Now, importantly, even with that division, the insulin resistance itself is really a combination of 2 things. One, it's that insulin isn't working the same way it used to in all the cells of the body, and I purposely say it that way, which seems a little vague, but there are some cells that are as responsive to insulin as ever. And indeed, that becomes part of the problem when we look at the second part of insulin resistance, which is that insulin resistance is inseparably connected to hyperinsulinemia. In other words, the insulin is elevated. That is an absolute essential part of the disorder. You can't tease those apart. If you take away the hyperinsulinemia, that is not insulin resistance. It's something else. It's maybe glucose intolerance that you see with long-term ketogenic diet adherence, or something different. But insulin resistance is hyperinsulinemia, whether it is a pathological state of insulin resistance, like the typical individual who's progressing towards type 2 diabetes, or even whether it's physiological insulin resistance, where the body's doing it on purpose to stimulate growth, like during puberty and pregnancy.
I want to tease this apart because it's so valuable right now to understand, and I wish I understood this as a doctor. A lot of times the ivory tower, which we just talked about, they'll look at insulin and they'll say, oh, we can't use it, because sometimes they're capturing early disease, that early hyperinsulinemia, and the disease is getting worse. And sometimes they're capturing hyperinsulinemia, but that pancreas has been redlining for years, and that insulin level may be coming down because the pancreas is like, I'm done.
Yeah.
I can't do anymore. And so you can have 2 insulin levels that are exactly the same, but they mean 2 different things.
That's right.
Well, guys, I'll tell you, in my brilliant talk in Denver, I used Ben's slide. He was so kind to let me use it, and that's impactful. I show people that all the time because you can see clearly the insulin going up and up and up while the sugar maintains. So if you're looking at the A1C of the sugar, you're going to miss the boat. And by the time you figure it out, it's too late. So I've had people actually shift themselves backwards on that curve and go back over the hump where their insulin goes from really low to high. and then back down to normal again, and their
that's
sugar's
nice.
normalized. And it's awesome to see that. When I saw that graph you made, Ben, I was like blown away, because I think, as a matter of fact, I would love to put a link to that on our podcast, and your slide with it looks like a flower with all the diseases causally related to insulin resistance, because I think that is, I'm sure that's in your book, but very, very powerful stuff, and it will really open people's eyes.
Can you help me tease apart just understanding the difference between hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance, or is there no difference? Should I, like, as a dumb internist, should I just view them as the same? Because I want to say I view it a little different. I view diet as more diet, inflammation, sleep more related to, well, I shouldn't say that. Diet probably most related to hyperinsulinemia, right? Hyperinsulinemia is probably most related to diet, but then insulin resistance can be, stress, sleep, chronic issues, and maybe the amount of muscle and activity you get. I mean, am I separating it right?
No, you are absolutely. It's an excellent question. They are two different things. So, for example, if someone is sleep deficient, they have one bad night of sleep, they will be demonstrably insulin resistant the next day. That is likely a result of an elevated cortisol. Cortisol makes muscle, for example, immediately more insulin resistant. That is insulin resistance at the muscle. Now, in that sort of series of events, if we're kind of going around this progression of events, we would start with the sleep deprivation causing systemic insulin resistance. So certain cells of the body are not responding to insulin as well. But then the body is thinking, wait, I'm going to eat this bagel now for breakfast after my sleep deprived night. I am having a harder time clearing that glucose into my muscle cells, which consumes up to 80% of the glucose when you eat a meal. So if the muscle's becoming insulin resistant, you're going to have a harder time controlling that glucose. And so if you're having a harder time bringing the glucose down, what is the pancreas going to do? Well, then it's going to stimulate more insulin to be released. And so in this case, the insulin resistance was causing the hyperinsulinemia. So and that would happen. It would happen in that sequence of events with sleep deprivation, which is itself a stress, so I could just sort of lump those two together, and inflammation as well. If someone has an autoimmune disorder, like rheumatoid arthritis, for example, it's fascinating just because of the detail that studies have shown. We can detect insulin resistance ebbing and flowing as the person has these inflammatory bouts, as the arthritis goes through these cycles of being worse or better. In times when the inflammation is very active, or the immune system is amped up and damaging its own tissue, in this case, the joints, we have the inflammation climbing and the insulin resistance follows it. And then the bout subsides, the joints start to feel a little better, the insulin resistance will come down as well. So in any case, stress or inflammation will cause insulin resistance, and then that will cause hyperinsulinemia. Now, if we put that one on the shelf, a different version of this sequence of events actually kind of goes backwards, which is someone who's eating high starchy, sugary meals 6 times a day. In that case, they're not experiencing, cortisol isn't going to necessarily be elevated. The inflammation isn't necessarily going to be up. In that case, it's the chronic hyperinsulinemia. The insulin is always elevated because they're eating 6 meals a day, always starchy, never giving insulin a chance to come down. In that case, the hyperinsulinemia is driving the insulin resistance, because that's a natural biological phenomenon. Too much of something will cause a resistance to that something, and that's just in an effort to maintain homeostasis in any organism. And you can find instances of that in other hormones in the body, not just insulin. And we know this. Even academically, if you give someone a hyperinsulinemic sort of infusion and then keeping their glucose in check by infusing glucose too, they will start to become insulin resistant just from that hyperinsulinemia. And this happens at fat cells and muscle cells and liver cells. That's all published evidence. And in my talk in Denver, which again, I'm so bummed I couldn't go, BYU had issued the travel ban literally the day before I was scheduled to come. But I almost wish I still would have snuck off and done it. But anyway, the talk that I gave remotely there, I end up showing several of the citations to support that idea. So anyway, Tro, that's my long answer to your question. The insulin resistance can be causing the hyperinsulinemia, or the hyperinsulinemia can be causing the insulin resistance. But regardless of the direction that sort of starts, it ends up being a circle that becomes this vicious cycle.
Yeah, and also I think a lot of us notice that when we're sleep deprived and when we eat terrible food the night before, the next morning we're starving when we wake up. I hear that from all of my patients.
Yep.
You know, it just triggers the brain, and you know, a lot of us in residency gained weight because we'd be up late all night, not sleep. So you're sleep deprived and eating terrible food all night because, you know, they have donuts at 2 a.m. or whatever it is.
Yeah, and when you're snacky, when you're looking around the house for a snack, no one is craving scrambled eggs. You know, you want junk food.
Yeah, and that's a huge point. Tro's made a huge effort on that of saying, look, people aren't binging on, you know, broccoli. People don't go, I'm going to go eat broccoli till I throw up. They're eating processed foods because that's the addiction part of this whole thing.
Yeah, well said.
Can I ask you a question, because this is a pet theory I have of mine, and you know, as it pertains to hunger, do you think that glycemia is more important, like the blood sugar fluctuating, or you think the insulin's more important? Because I think that my pet theory is, you know, all this insulin stuff, it's like the chronic driver. But in that moment, you know, I can take somebody, I can cut their stomach to the size of a pea. But if I shift their blood sugar down 20, 30 points, their brain is on fire for food.
Oh, yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree with that. I think that acute phase of hunger is totally glucose driven. So hunger does sort of come in phases during a fast where, yeah, the immediate hunger that someone experiences, in my also admittedly somewhat naive view, so I'm speculating here, it's really the combination of both glucose sort of bump, and then is there something in the intestines that itself can be uncomfortable for someone to feel that food has moved through the stomach and now it's a little empty. They feel that emptiness, and then it just stimulates some hunger. So yeah, I agree, Tro. When especially if someone is used to a higher level of glucose, you know, if someone is used to living with a glucose level in the low hundreds milligrams per deciliter, if that drops down, let's say even down to 70 or something, which is still completely compatible with perfectly healthy living, to them the red lights go, where the brain is just used to this high level of glucose, and now it senses a relative deficiency, not an absolute deficiency, but a relative deficiency, and it thinks, hold on, I am a sugar burner, I'm a sugar burning body, my blood sugar is getting down, I've got to just make sure I bump that back up. But that comes with this metabolic inflexibility that is itself connected to insulin resistance, where the body, as you guys of course know, it's a hybrid. The body is burning blood sugar or fat really in high levels at any moment. It's this sort of balance of the two. If you are stuck in sugar burning mode, or blood glucose burning mode, then if the glucose starts to go down, it's panic time. But someone who has trained their body to be metabolically flexible, glucose can come down. That's no problem. They're so good at burning fat, and the brain is so good at using ketones. And Jake Kushner highlighted this in one of his talks when he looks at the utility of ketogenic diets in type 1 diabetics. Classically, if a type 1 diabetic starts to get low with their glucose levels, they feel it, and it is disastrous with their overall well-being and their immediate state of mind. But those type 1 diabetics that get down to 50 milligrams per deciliter, for example, that are adhering to a ketogenic diet and are adapted to that, they don't feel any sort of deficit. They don't notice that they're getting low. They feel perfectly fine, and that could just be because their body is so trained to use fat and ketones.
Yeah, there was actually a study on that way back in the day. We couldn't get it approved now, but yeah, Jason Fung talks about it. I can't remember the exact study, but they dropped these guys way down when they were ketogenic. Yeah. Right? You know what I'm talking about?
I know the exact study you're talking about. I think that was George Cahill, but you're totally right.
Correct.
Those starvation studies that they did are just, you gotta appreciate what they were able to do in sort of the Wild West days of medical science.
Yeah, now we can't do that. And I think the
Oh,
big
no.
thing we haven't really talked about is the glucagon effect, right? When people have really high insulin, that's why people don't understand. They look at people who are 400 pounds, they say, why can't they be hungry all the time? They have a ton of fat storage, but they can't get to those stores when their glucagon is screwed up. Insulin suppressing the glucagon effect, correct? To break down the fatty acids.
Yeah. So that is one of the tragedies of part of our marketing of foods, where, here I live in beautiful Utah. People love to go hike through the mountains. One of the popular hikes is hiking up to the Y. Up the mountain here. There's a big Y, just in honor of sort of BYU, the main Y, the big Y there. People will hike the Y, and they got their Gatorade, they got their energy bars, and I'm looking at the person and I'm thinking, you don't have a deficiency of energy. You got energy all over your body. You got energy bars strapped all over your body, just waiting to be used. Just you can't tap them until insulin comes down. And so don't take an energy bar, take some water and maybe some electrolytes. But yeah, it is one of the tragedies. But that I look at as an insulin problem. And then insulin and glucagon, of course, are just sort of reciprocally regulated. And they have reciprocal functions where insulin stimulating fat storage, glucagon stimulating fat breakdown.
A lot of times, just along this discussion, we have a brilliant scientist here, so I got to go deep down into the science. A lot of times I've wondered, why is it, we had a patient that came to me on we put him on a whole food plant-based diet, and immediately we saw their hunger go down. I mean, he's like, I'm not hungry. And this isn't the general advice we give. It happened to be just respecting his wishes. Yep. But we helped him orchestrate a whole food plant-based diet, and we saw the blood sugar completely stabilize.
Yeah.
And he tells me, I'm not hungry anymore. I'm not hungry anymore. And then we had somebody come into our office wanting to do shakes, and they did a shake for breakfast, a shake for lunch, and a sensible dinner. And their CGM looks much more flat, right? Just like that whole food plant-based approach. And he's telling me that, she's telling me she's not hungry anymore. So it made me think, that maybe how all these diets may or may not work is they may be addressing hunger in different ways.
Yeah.
One of which could be, and how is it that fasts? People tell me on fasts they're not hungry, and you look at their CGM and it's completely stable, right? So I think that there's something to that, and everything you're saying is absolutely right. I happen to think those other ways are not sustainable or not completely sustainable on their own, but there is merits to why people succeed in other dietary paradigms. So I
totally agree. I absolutely agree, and I wouldn't ever want someone to look at me and hear me speak and think Bikman's only in favor of more carnivore type diets. I deeply appreciate the utility there, but I also appreciate that if someone is eating a diet that is whole food, plant based, even as much as I worry a little bit that the person would eventually become deficient in things that are essential the further they move away from animal products. Nevertheless, what I hope they would have in common, carnivore and or sort of vegan, if it's plant-based, although you can be vegan and eat all kinds of junk. But the common core hopefully would be that they're both avoiding processed foods. And the more you're avoiding processed food, the less frequently you're going to have excursions with blood glucose levels. And Tro, I think it's what you guys are both seeing, where if someone is flatlining their glucose levels, I think that goes a long way to just let the brain know, hey, we're nourished. We don't need to be eating. It's these big excursions where it comes up and they got that rebound, kind of relative hypoglycemic rebound, that the body just starts to panic, 2 or 3 hours after eating a starchy, sugary meal. They feel like they need something, even though it's ludicrous. They just ate plenty 2 hours ago.
Yeah, and something you said, Ben, that made me think a lot too is when you talk about the sugars, you get a new set point for your glucose level. So it could be your body abnormal is normal for most of us. That's the problem. And blood pressure is the same way. We've all experienced, we try to get someone on blood pressure meds and they feel terrible, but their blood pressure is still not normal. It's still high, but they feel terrible because they're used to running at 200 rather than 140 or less. So when you get them down, you have to take your time sometimes. Now what we're finding through your studies and a lot of the people out there that we're saying, hey, if you drop those insulin levels, the blood pressure normalizes on its own. And so we have to watch it, right? So that's the benefit of me copying Tro, is that we could have these 24-hour blood pressure cuffs and see what people are actually doing when they're stressed, when they're at home. and really know what we're doing to take people off of medications. And that's really exciting.
That is some great data too, to kind of look at the whole area under the curves with regards to someone's minute by minute blood pressure, or not, if it's not minute by minute, but continuous blood pressure readings. Yeah, that's some powerful data right there to see it drop. And as you guys have undoubtedly seen, I hear stories, because I'm not a clinician, so I just hear them secondhand, where people have to get off their blood pressure meds within days of dietary changes to lower insulin, because when insulin comes down, aldosterone comes down. Then as aldosterone comes down, the kidneys just start letting extra salt and water go. And as volume goes, pressure comes down quickly.
Yeah, you know, just as an aside, just this week, it makes me happy. One of my patients, type 2 diabetes, out of control, hadn't been seen in a while. Anyways, we got him all monitored up on his CGM, and he said that was the best thing that's ever happened, because he knows what he eats certain things, even though they say they're fine, his sugars go crazy. So he said, okay, I'll cut this out. So he's been and I get his sugars on my cell phone all the time. So it's cool, because I can look, I'm smiling to myself thinking, man, he's doing awesome, going from 200s to like 108, 98,
That's amazing.
like in that range. But he lost weight, and his last blood pressure I did in the office was like 156 over 100. Now it's like 112 over 58 or something. And it's like, oh, we got to cut back on your meds. Really? Yeah, cool. But we love to see that stuff, and that's the pleasure of what we're doing, and a lot of that we learn from you. You know, I know Tro's going to be fun, but I want to get back to your book for a minute, man. I'm going to change gears. What other stuff are you going through in your book about, you know, why we get sick? You know, one of the big impacts on me was Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It by Gary Taub. So this kind of reminds me of that.
Yeah. So
this as a series, right?
I know. Yeah. So I ended up kind of warning Gary ahead of time. And I just have so much respect for everything he's done. And I need to just say, I really credit him and his book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, for me kind of where I stopped being so quiet about what I'd been suspecting for a little while. Gary really helped me be brave enough to just say, you know what, I'm unapologetically in favor now of talking about low carb diets, whereas I had been very secretive about it. So nevertheless, yeah, I warned him ahead of time that, hey, my title's a little derivative of yours, and I don't want to step on your toes. He, of course, couldn't care less. Wasn't upset about it at all. And it's a bit of a bold title, but I wanted it to be like that because I really do hope that there's, in some way, a change in the conversation within a medical setting, and that is just putting insulin on the radar, even in something like type 2 diabetes, which is so common, increasingly common, not only in the U.S., but throughout the world. North Africa and the Middle East are even worse than what we have here with regards to the per capita number of type 2 diabetics. So this is a global problem. It's getting worse every day. Even in type 2 diabetes, insulin is not a part of the conversation when it really should be. I think that we should look at type 2 diabetes as an insulin disease rather than a glucose disease, because as you noted, you can detect the problem so much sooner. The evidence suggests that you can at least detect this progression towards type 2 diabetes 10 years before the glucose levels change. I've said this so many times, so I worry that all your listeners have heard me say it before, but because I'm a professor, I can't help repeating myself. But if we look at the progression of the disorder, insulin has been climbing and fighting this silent war for years. Insulin, the body's becoming progressively more resistant to it, so we need more and more and more of it in order to keep the glucose in check. But it works. The glucose stays checked. And then eventually, the body becomes so resistant to its own insulin, even though it is as high as it can get, the glucose levels start to climb. And then the problem is exacerbated, made worse by the fact that insulin levels will start to come down. And then the glucose levels start to climb even faster. Now, importantly about that progression, insulin does not run out. It does not go to zero like many people talk about. Insulin becomes deficient or insufficient to control blood glucose. Now, that's a relative term, and I think a little misleading, where people will hear that and conclude that the absolute levels of insulin are now too low. They're running down to zero, almost as if it's become like type 1 diabetes. But it doesn't happen that way. The study, the figure that I created, Brian, that you mentioned, I adapted that from one of the studies from Jake Kushner who I mentioned earlier, and others, but they beautifully show that progression of insulin levels, how it's climbing, and it starts to come down, but it's still multiples higher than it is in a normal non-diabetic individual who doesn't have insulin resistance. It's still elevated. It is still hyperinsulinemia. It's just not as dramatic as it was before. So anyway, whether it's type 2 diabetes or other disorders like I've already mentioned, PCOS or hypertension, fatty liver, even like Alzheimer's disease, insulin is extremely significant as a variable in predicting who is going to develop Alzheimer's disease over the years. So that's more of sort of an insight into the book, and even sort of maternal. What are the kind of congenital fetal environmental factors that can also increase the offspring's greater risk of becoming insulin resistant. And it's not just that mom is overweight and diabetic. It can also be that mom was starving during the pregnancy. That also stimulates insulin resistance in the offspring. So anyway, insulin resistance is complicated. I certainly tell that story, but again, it is, the happy ending is that it is so solvable. You can take someone who's profoundly insulin resistant type 2 diabetic, and as they start to make lifestyle changes, especially diet, insulin sensitivity starts to turn around really immediately.
Yeah, and that brings back hope, right? I see
Absolutely.
Tro breathing because he wants to talk to you. We're like two kids when you're here because we get so excited, man. It's so great to talk to you about this stuff. Go ahead, Tro, man.
No, I'm just thinking out loud here. You know, I've sort of stopped viewing insulin resistance because as a disease, right? I view it as an expected phenomenon. You know, I'm just going to give you this anecdote. Last fall, you know, right around November, my wife threw away all the Halloween candy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I saw there's a massive bear we've seen in the trails in my area, me and my kids, in the past. Not a massive, it's a black bear, but it's big enough. And when she threw away the Halloween candy, that bear raided my garbage can 4 days in a row. And now I've seen that bear several times, and the last time, the bear and the cub actually, it was so skinny in the spring. And now in the fall, this thing was massive, huge. Like I didn't even want to go near it. Like I told my kids stay in the house, you know, like this is a huge bear. Now that bear probably had triglycerides of 300. That bear probably had insulin resistance. That bear had adiposity. And that is absolutely a survival advantage for that bear. In fact, if that bear got pregnant in times of famine, that insulin resistance would have been surely a protector for the fetus, right? For the cub to be. So that's when I stopped viewing insulin resistance as a disease and started viewing it more as a natural process that's been exploited and that's been, you know, so can you, I mean, I don't know. What do you think? Am I on
Oh, no.
am I
So,
crazy here?
No, I don't think so. In fact, I alluded to that at the outset. There is physiological insulin resistance. That happens even in the most perfect environment. The person can be the healthiest, be checking every box with regards to strategies to stay healthy. And during puberty and during pregnancy, it doesn't matter. They will become insulin resistant, and they're supposed to. And so especially in the context of pregnancy, mom becomes progressively more and more insulin resistant throughout the course of the pregnancy. And it's meant to happen. And the baby is born, and the insulin sensitivity goes right back to normal. Especially if she didn't become gestational diabetic. That's just when it goes to, that's when it does blend over or spill over into pathological insulin resistance. But nevertheless, that mounting insulin of the insulin resistance, without a doubt, is doing two things. It is helping mom get fat. It is also helping prepare for lactation. Insulin is part of that cocktail of preparing for lactation, that hormonal cocktail, but it's also stimulating the fetus to grow. It's accelerating fetal growth and accelerating fetal fat deposition, because we are meant to have fat babies. They're supposed to be chubby. And there's a really awesome scientist, Stephen Cunnane, who's really highlighted the unique attributes of humans, where we are the only land-based mammals that have obese babies. So that's one thing that is unique about us. We're the only ones with fat, obese babies, and we're the only ones whose babies the brain is bigger than the birth canal, much to mom's chagrin, of course. So we have these big, hungry brains, and we have all this fat. Now, of course, fat tissue feeds brains by becoming ketones, and so a lot of his focus is looking at the influence of ketones on brain health, and so that's sort of putting some pieces of data together that we're obese babies were born obese, and we have big, hungry, energy-hungry brains. Indeed, the little baby, I think the brain is the most energy active organ, and then as we grow older, it's the kidneys, actually. In fact, just as an aside, the metabolic rate of the kidneys is like 10 times higher than anything else. As we measure metabolic rate of kidneys in the lab, it's almost impossible because we have to keep feeding it more oxygen because it just gobbles it up so quickly. But anyway, back to the point. So we're born obese, we have hungry brains, and I really have sort of shifted topics here, but the insulin resistance helps baby be fat, and baby needs that fat because once baby's born, it's going to be tapping into it to feed the brain in the form of ketones. So yeah, insulin resistance is a natural phenomenon. It exists in nature. It exists, and even further, in humans throughout life.
I'd contend it was even a survival advantage when there wasn't constant food surplus.
Yeah.
I'd contend that it was probably a survival advantage. What do you say?
Yeah. So I see your point, where if you could become insulin resistant, if that is helping raise insulin to stimulate fat cell expansion to rely on during a time of caloric deprivation, of starvation, then absolutely. And there is, what's his name? In fact, Richard Johnson is a scientist who has looked at this shift in the enzyme with regards to uric acid. And he looks at how through the evolution of humans, or species, primates, including humans, have this inability to break down uric acid, and the uric acid can also stimulate fat cell growth. And it was thought that this could have been a survival mechanism to allow the species to survive during times of famine. But yeah, nevertheless, the ability to have insulin climb and stay elevated to foster fat cell growth is an advantage. Now, one wrinkle in that theory, if we look at insulin resistance as a necessary part of that, it gets a little complicated simply because typical whole body insulin resistance usually starts with fat cell insulin resistance. Now, the problem there is that when the fat cells become insulin resistant, they stop growing. And so the insulin resistance ends up being a check almost to the growth of the fat cell. But fat cells can grow in two ways. And it could be part of our modern environment that makes them grow more in a sick way, but that's partly genetics and partly diet, where fat cells are growing just through the individual cells getting really big through hypertrophy. And that is where they get a limit. The fat cell reaches its limit and it becomes insulin resistant to make sure it doesn't grow any further. Or you have the alternative form of fat growth where the fat cells are multiplying, none of them getting too big on their own, and then the person stays very insulin sensitive. They will become morbidly obese, but they actually look okay. If you look at their blood panel, they're all right. And that partly is really the distinguishing feature between these two states, where someone's kind of fat but really sick, and then really fat and kind of healthy. Well, healthy, I use that term loosely.
I want to segue to one quick thing, because we were talking about blood pressure. We're talking about the brain needing to be able to use fats. We talked about all these things. And I just, before this gym lockdown happened, I was in the gym and I saw somebody after their workout going and getting a protein shake with banana and with strawberries and I'm thinking to myself, holy crap, this guy just used a lot of fuel.
Yeah.
Just like restocking up with fuel that's literally going to make him more hungry. His blood sugar is going to spike up. He looked like he had a phenotypic insulin resistant, appearance, like just somebody that you think, okay, doesn't need that energy, and I'm just thinking to myself, okay, after all this peanut butter and banana and strawberry and, protein, that what's going to happen 3 hours later, because his blood sugar is going to spike, his insulin's he's going to become hyperinsulinemic. He's one, going to be adding to the problem of pathologic insulin resistance. And then two, he's going to be like, that's with that chronic process, but two, he's literally going to be hungry 2 to 3 hours later when his blood sugar goes up and tanks back down. And that's a lot of times I'm telling people, you know, after the gym, you don't want to have a lot of sugar unless you feel lightheaded. And so, you know, I've seen this, and the problem with a lot of proteins I've seen in the gym, you know, is that they're packed with sugar, or the people eating them are basically taking them and you know, they're adding sugar to it. And here, let me take it one step worse. When people go on a low carb diet, we were talking about that blood pressure coming down. We were talking about, you know, the aldosterone, all that coming down. I've had people tell me, oh, I felt a little lightheaded after the gym. Oh, I had a protein shake with a banana and 2 strawberries and peanut butter, right? Because I felt lightheaded. I'm just thinking to myself, like, look, it's a little lightheaded. Just take a little salt, take a little water. You don't need you can eat protein and fat, no problem. Okay. But protein and carbs, it's kind of adding to the problem that we're dealing with. So what do you say about this? How do you feel about, like, I want to tie it all together here in this post-gym experience, you know, tell me what you think.
Yeah, that's a great, in fact, I agree with what you said. When someone's feeling lightheaded during a state of even mild fasting, it's probably not that they're running out of glucose. It is probably that blood pressure is getting uncomfortable, or it's an electrolyte getting low issue. So get some salt, a little bit of salt in your water. I agree with that wholeheartedly. And then part of the problem with protein is what you stack it with. And I like how you described it that way, where so commonly people are stacking their protein with carbohydrate. And Stu Phillips at McMaster University, one of the really the protein gurus, he published a paper finding that if you add glucose to protein, you do not get any improvement over normal, just protein-induced alone anabolic responses at muscle. So looking at muscle protein synthesis, the degree to which the muscle is actually pulling in amino acids and making new muscle protein from it, adding glucose to that doesn't improve it at all. But however, if you stack the protein with fat, then it does. It is significantly higher. The protein and the fat stacked together elicits a significantly higher muscle protein synthesis than the protein alone. And I think that is reflected in nature. There is really no source of food that is high carbohydrate and high protein. I mean, there's you could say, well, dairy is, and dairy is a bit of an anomaly. It's actually high in all three. And I think it's perfect. It's meant to be. It is this perfect milkshake of growth. It will stimulate an animal to grow when you're high in all three macros. But fat and protein in nature do come together. Look at any protein source, and nature will have fat coming along with it. And I think it's difficult to want to tease those apart. And I think when we do tease them apart, I think we do so at our to our detriment. I mean, I don't mean to sound dramatic about it. I have a deep appreciation for protein, but I think that we as a species are, in fact, there's this guy, an anthropologist, scientist, I think that is his role, Mickey Bendori, who has this a book where it's something titled like Man, the Fat Hunter. And he just talks about how through human evolution, humans would eat the fattiest of the meats, and that could be partly biologically driven more than just we love the mouthfeel of it. But nevertheless, even if we come back to the muscle angle and post-workout, fat and protein stacked together will have a more anabolic effect than the protein alone. But there is no window. In fact, the same Stu Phillips said it's not a protein window where, you know, people say I worked out, I got to get my protein shake an hour after my workout. No, that does not appear to be the case at all. It looks like, in fact, I think he compared it to like a hangar, an airport hangar door, where it's this massive window, or this broad space where it's essentially this rolling kind of 24 hours. Have you gotten enough protein within a 24-hour window? Massive window of time to support that workout, or to recover from the workout, and that's the relevant aspect to that there. So it's not a narrow little window. If someone's looking for some protein, I would suggest look at protein with fat. That's because the evidence suggests it works better.
Well, here I want to talk about this because I've cautioned a lot of my patients, and Brian's like, "Oh my God, Tro's talking again." But I've cautioned a lot of my patients, and we do recommend protein powders. And I hear you have a very good protein powder coming out or out already, very high quality. Now, one of the problems with protein powder, if you look at Clean Label Project, the nonprofit that analyzed the 20 protein powders out in over 100 protein powders out in the market, they found a lot of contaminants, and they found cadmium, they found heavy metals, particularly in the plant-based products. The pea proteins and the carrot and starch proteins that they're trying to basically extract these proteins, and they're getting a lot of heavy metals and contaminants. And so I tell my patients, like, look, you have to try to find a very high quality source protein. And I know that's something that, somebody like you would stand by. So I have no reservation, recommending basically your line of protein. Can you tell us about that? Why you started that? Who you started it with, what's in it, and what makes it different?
Yeah. So I like how you said that. You framed it, though, in looking at introducing the two types of proteins, where they generally will fall into two classifications, plant or animal. And I appreciate that there is an incredible global push to focus on plant-based foods. And I think that is deeply unfortunate, even in the context of plant protein. Plant proteins are inferior to animal protein in every way. They don't have as optimal a mix of amino acids, and they won't, even if you do have all of the essential amino acids, so allowing it to be called a complete protein, and some plants can, they are still significantly less usable and absorbable by the body. So you'd have to be getting a lot more of those plant proteins to try to equal the efficacy of animal-based proteins. But of course, in the process, as you're eating more and more and more of that, you're getting more and more of stuff you don't want, like some of the molecules you mentioned, minerals, or even other like plant-based hormones, like phytoestrogens, which might have an effect in people. So yeah, the best proteins are whey and egg white. That is well documented. And then, so what we did with this was simply looking at more and more of these meal replacement shakes that were coming out, and how they were all focusing on plants, and they were all trying to be low calorie. And I resent that. I don't think that's the way it should be. I think we should not try to starve people to weight loss. That if we continue to follow the traditional advice of eat less, exercise more, all we do is make people hungry. In fact, I ripped this off of Gary Taubes, but when I talk about obesity to my students in my pathophysiology class, I present that paradigm, which is, imagine I'm having everyone come over to my house for dinner, and I have the world's best chefs coming, and they're going to prepare the most beautiful foods you can imagine. It's a buffet. I want you to eat as much as you can, come as hungry as possible. I ask the students, what would you do to make sure you came as hungry as possible? And over the course of a few minutes, these 150 brilliant little brains kind of come to this consensus of two things. They would eat less and they would exercise more. Now, I'm not saying those are bad things, but if that becomes the foundational pillars of weight loss, it becomes a problem, because as the students accurately pointed out, those are the two things that you do to make sure you're as hungry as possible. And in our environment of immediately accessible foods, hunger will win. And so don't try to starve yourself to weight loss. Nourish the body, teach the body to use its own energy for fuel, and then hunger will start to control itself much, much better than just trying to starve itself. So with Complete Meal, and anyone who's curious about this, I won't go into details too much, but go to Get Health, and that's HLTH.com, gethealth.com, HLTH.
And we'll put a link to that, because I've messed
that sounds great. Yeah. But please, anyone check it out more to look at the nutritional profile. But
can I talk about it for a second? Because a lot of times, I promote real food almost, religiously. I quote unquote promote real food, meaning beef, chicken, eggs, Greek yogurt, fish, seafood. But I tell people replace what you cannot restrict. And a lot of times they're surprised when I tell them, hey, go get, health code protein, or go get, this whey protein, or go get this cookie, because at that point, I'm looking at it like, okay, what's the best I can do? You're going to have chocolate ice cream. Yeah. Why not have a high quality chocolate shake that doesn't leave you in a disaster 3 hours later and hungry for more, right? And why don't you have a cookie that doesn't leave you hungry for more 3 hours later and isn't adding to this problem of insulin resistance, right? So I view it as, okay, so I don't really support supplements. I don't say that they're bad. I don't support these dirty keto stuff, right? But I also don't say it's bad because I use it. I use it and it's been very useful for me, but other times it's been a crutch. So, that's how I've intellectualized it. So I'm curious to hear what you think, because I know you're also a real food proponent.
Yep.
But
I sure am.
How do you, I feel like there's a little bit of nuance here. It's like, cannot be like, I also don't believe in supplements, but here I am. I have like keto chow in my lobby, and I tell people to take electrolytes, particularly early on, when they're fasting and if they feel lightheaded. So I'm promoting a supplement. I have no financial relationship with them, but I'm promoting a supplement. So how do you reconcile this? I'm sure, people will come after you and say, oh, Ben Bikman, he just, wants to sell a supplement. Can you just talk about this for a little bit? Now, I know you don't, but I'm sure some vegan person will come and say, he's no different than, that director Cameron who's, investing in the pre-proteins that are, contain heavy metals.
How do
you respond to that?
And I'll say, just from my standpoint too, I've always been a proponent of whole food, right? Doing whole food stuff. And I looked at your ingredient list and I was really impressed by that. And plus, obviously, if it was anyone else, I wouldn't even try it. But because it was you, Ben, I know your character and integrity. And I'm like, okay, I'll try it and see. And it tastes great. And it's awesome. But I think I just need to know where it fits into a regimen to really help people. I think what is if I can advise someone to have, and I think part of it is people just get sick of having the same stuff. On a ketogenic diet, we could be very monotonous. But where do you see it fitting into a good regimen for a guy like me who's trying to take off another 20 pounds? Okay, Brian, here's the regimen to go with, because I'm actually going to try it and I'll talk about it on the podcast, honestly, about what happens. But
so guys, thanks. I am an advocate of whole foods. Absolutely, no question. But as you guys have noticed, I certainly have. One of the benefits of a diet that is increasingly controlling carbohydrates is that it starts to increasingly rely on real food. That is a good thing. I think it's really one of the incredible perks of a low carb diet. You can't help but have to go to real food. That is a good thing. The downside to that is it does take more time and to go out, get the real foods, and then do the shopping to prepare the meal. Now, I think that's a good thing, especially if it means more time with the family, especially, which I'm always an advocate of. But there is just something undeniably convenient about having access to a shake. And so that was part of the impetus when a couple of my brothers and I, and that's who constitutes Health Code, the company, it was sensing that there is more and more of these meal replacement shakes are all plant-based, and I get it. It's easy to sell that. People love to see that. It's far cheaper to get plant protein than it is animal protein, even though it is far more inferior. But it was sensing this need, and then acknowledging that there's a convenience factor to it. And then Tro, your point that maybe even in some instances an indulgence where this is a kind of a rich sort of chocolatey flavor, but it's natural though. The sweeteners are stevia, a new form of stevia that doesn't have the bitter aftertaste, which I've never cared for. And then monk fruit, so it's natural sweeteners. It's keto friendly, but it was those two things. So I'm repeating myself. It was the convenience, because there's something undeniably convenient about having access to that. And then to sensing a need, where so many of the alternative meal replacement shakes are plant-based. But this is built on what I like to joke is a divine ratio of protein to fat. So by mass, the amount of protein and fat is 1-to-1 exactly. And then there's a little bit of fiber in there too. But it's that is better for muscle protein recovery. So even if someone's looking at it as strictly through the lens of sports recovery, it's a winner. And then in the context of improving metabolic health, this provides all the essential fats, the essential amino acids with the built on the macronutrients that have the least effect on insulin, and that to me is a good thing.
Well, look, let's talk about metabolic health, because we know that just calorie for calorie, even if you replace the carbohydrate with fat, that metabolic syndrome begins to reverse. So I think if I'm talking to my patient who's going to be doing that, peanut butter, 2 bananas,
Yep.
5 strawberry protein shake, I'm like, hey, look, listen, why don't you just replace it with this and see how your body feels and test it out? And, particularly if it's plant-based, I don't have, I think the argument that the amino acid profile is inferior, I think it's true, but it's probably a nominal benefit, nominal benefit. But ultimately, I think the real worry is with those plant-based proteins, it's the contaminants that you get along with it. When they're processing those pea and vegetable proteins, it's just, you don't know what you're buying, versus like literally when they make whey, they're just skimming off the,
Yep.
the top layer. It's not like there's not a lot of bleaching and heating and cooling involved.
Yeah, and then if
But
it's the
you're
egg
getting
white, it's just the white of the egg. I mean, there's
Right,
nothing
exactly. Yep.
complicated about it.
Yeah, so I think that this does fit a role, and I've recommended it, and the people, I've recommended the use of protein in my practice a lot, particularly for replacing that kind of milkshake urge, that ice cream urge that people can't restrict. If you cannot restrict that, what's the sense? You got to make it work. It has to be pragmatic. And then, lo and behold, I remember 5 years ago, I was doing 2 protein shakes a day, and maybe now I do 1 a week or so, so I still use it, but I'm not beholden to it. So,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think
Yeah,
this
I
is
agree.
I can't wait to try it. I'm going to be trying it. So, one thing I would like to do, just kind of before, we part ways, is I just want to get your insight, because everybody wants to know about COVID right now. How are you handling yourself with all this? Just pragmatically, forget about the science, forget about all of it. How are you keeping yourself healthy? How are you keeping your family healthy? How are you, what's been your approach to deal with all this?
Yeah. So Tro, this has become what a hot button topic. And I hope that people can have this conversation without burning bridges. And I say that not necessarily just between me and you, but even anyone listening to this. I'd hate to make enemies. It seems that there's a spectrum when it comes to COVID-19 where there are some sort of skeptics, a skeptical side, and then kind of an alarmist side. And I fall more on the end of the skeptical side, where the data from John Ioannidis from Stanford suggests that this isn't quite the apocalyptic infection that we were originally told it would be. But again, I say that as a scientist, and anyone who's had any experience with a loved one having it, I don't mean to throw any shade on that circumstance. So I do fall on the side of being a little skeptical about it being an end of the world type problem. Thank heavens, Utah as a state has maintained a pretty open state relative to many others, certainly, where we can go out pretty liberally with the kids. The one complication, of course, is homeschooling, which my family, it's always seems like it's a bit of a mixed bag.
How are you handling that? How are you handling
it's
that? How's
tough.
your wife? How are your kids handling it?
Yeah. So it's tough. We've got 3 kids, and my wife, Cheryl, she is an at-home mom, so she's sort of full-time duty with the kids, and which can be much. My younger 2 need almost constant hand-holding through every lesson, whereas my older one just sort of knocks it all out. She's in a Chinese immersion. She's just one of those kind of precocious little kids, just likes to learn and loves school and just gets it done. She hates homeschool because she misses her buddies at school, but the younger 2 love it, although mom and dad don't with them. But I do love the time the family's spending together. I really do. My schedule as a professor is flexible enough that I can stay home and help. Usually I don't come to the office until I've gotten at least one of the younger 2 totally done. and then Cheryl kind of finishes with the other, in the morning. But we're always done in the morning, and the kids just play with some of the other kids in the neighborhood. And I've heard stories in other states where the cops are knocking on their door saying your kid can't go play at this person's house. And again, Utah doesn't have any of that. So my kids are out playing with the other kids, and I think it's great. Now I'll say that not to make it scientific, a lot of my philosophy on life is acknowledging what is within one's sphere of influence. So what can I control about this? I can have some degree of control of the degree to which my family will be exposed, although again, that doesn't worry me very much. And that would just be proper hygiene. But I also acknowledge the incredible, undeniably growing connection between metabolic health and the lethality of the disease. So the idea of helping keep my family's metabolic health in check is very important to me, well beyond outside the scope of just COVID-19. But the data really are clear. If someone is metabolically compromised, obesity, diabetes, hypertension, it is multiples more likely that this disease is going to do something really meaningfully bad in them. So I just continue to focus on not only proper hygiene, yep, absolutely, I think it's always important, but also proper nutrition and sleep habits. And we're sticklers with sleep habits. As summer's kind of coming, I know the kids in the neighborhood, they're staying out till all hours, and not my kids. We're a little more lenient with their bedtimes, but it's just kind of like 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock for the youngest, middle, and oldest. And they'll say, I'm not tired. And I'll say, well, you don't have to sleep, but you got to be in bed.
It's funny. It's the same line I use with my kids. You don't have to sleep, but you got to be in bed. And then they fall asleep.
Exactly.
Listen, so how do, obviously an absolute pleasure to have you here. We love talking with you, and hopefully you and I can work on some things.
I'd love it.
Hopefully there'll be some amazing things coming from us in the future. But how can people find you? How can they find your book? How can they find your protein? How do they find all of these things? And how do they get a hold of you?
Yeah. Thanks again, Tro. I really enjoyed the conversation. Talking with you and Brian, it's always fun. It's this delightful mix of intellectually stimulating and then just a few guys hanging out and being casual and friendly, and each trying to be more self-deprecating than the other, it seems. So, which goes a long way with me. I love that. So thanks again. My involvement on social media is almost entirely just to share research, just to try to bridge that gap that I mentioned at the beginning. I'm mostly involved more and more actually on Instagram and Facebook, just because it seems like I'm getting more traction in people engaging more friendly and more effectively with people there. But at both of those outlets, it's Ben Bikman or Benjamin Bikman, and Bikman is Bikman, PhD. And one of them is Ben Bikman, PhD. The other one is Benjamin Bikman, PhD. And then Twitter, Ben Bikman, PhD as well. And then the website for the book, anywhere books are sold. It's pre-sale now, so Amazon, Barnes & Noble. The book is Why We Get Sick. And then the shake, if people are interested in learning more or even getting some, Get Health, and health is HLTH, gethealth.com. But it's a great shake, and I really do think people could have a pretty good experience with it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on.
Sure, my pleasure. Thank you.